The Lives of the Dead, page 213 through 233. But this too is true. Stories can save us. I'm 43 years old and a writer now, and even still, right here, I keep dreaming Linda alive, and Ted Lavender too, and Kiowa and Kurt Lemon, and a slim young man I killed, and an old man sprawled beside a pig pen, several others whose bodies I once lifted and dumped into a truck. They're all dead, but in a story, which is kind of dreaming, the dead sometimes smile and sit up and return to the world. Start here, a body without a name. On an afternoon in 1969, the platoon took sniper fire from a filthy little village along the South China Sea. It lasted only a minute or two, and nobody was hurt, but even so, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross got on the radio and ordered up an airstrike. For the next half hour, we watched the place burn. It was a cool, bright morning, like early autumn. The jets were glossy black against the sky. When it ended, we formed into a loose line and swept east through the village. It was all wreckage. I remember the smell of burnt straw. I remember broken fences, and torn up trees, and heaps of stone and brick and pottery. The place was deserted. No people, no animals, and the only confirmed kill was an old man who lay face up near a pig pen at the center of the village. His right arm was gone. At his face there were already many flies and gnats. Dave Jensen went over and shook the old man's hand. "Howdy do," he said. One by one the others did it too. They didn't disturb the body, they just grabbed the old man's hand and offered a few words and moved away. Rat Kiley bent over the corpse. "Gimme 5, he said. "A real honor." "Pleased as punch," said Henry Dobbins. I was brand new to the war. It was my 4th day. I hadn't yet developed a sense of humor. Right away, as if I'd swallowed something, I felt a moist sickness rise up in my throat. I sat down beside the pig pen, closed my eyes, put my head between my knees. After a moment, Dave Jensen touched my shoulder. "Be polite now," he said. "Go introduce yourself. Nothing to be afraid about, just a nice old man. Show a little respect for your elders." "No way." "Maybe it's too real for you?" "That's right," I said. "Way too real." Jensen kept after me, but I didn't go near the body. I didn't even look at it except by accident. For the rest of the day there was still the sickness inside me. But it wasn't the old man's corpse so much. It was the awesome act of greeting the dead. At one point, I remember, they sat the body up against a fence. They crossed his legs and talked to him. "The guest of honor," Mitchell Sanders said, and placed a can of orange slices in the old man's lap. "Vitamin C," he said gently. "A guy's health, that's the most important thing." They proposed toast. They lifted their canteens and drank to the old man's family and ancestors, his many grandchildren, his newfound life after death. It was more than mockery. There was a formality to it, like a funeral without the sadness. Dave Jensen flicked his eyes at me. "Hey, O'Brien," he said. "You got a toast in mind?" "Never too late for manners." I found things to do with my hands. I looked away and tried not to think. Late in the afternoon, just before dusk, Kiowa came up and asked if he could sit at my foxhole for a minute. He offered me a Christmas cookie from a batch his father had sent him. It was February now, but the cookies tasted fine. After a few moments, Kiowa watched the sky. "You did a good thing today," he said. "That shaking hands crap, it isn't decent. The guys'll hassle you for a while, especially Jensen, but just keep saying no. Should have done it myself. Takes guts, I know that." "Wasn't guts. I was scared." Kiowa shrugged. "Same difference." "No, I couldn't do it. A mental block or something. I don't know, just creepy." "Well, you're new here. You'll get used to it." He paused for a second, studying the green and red sprinkles on a cookie. "Today, I guess this is your first look at a real body?" I shook my head. All day long I'd been picturing Linda's face, the way she smiled. "It sounds funny," I said, "but the poor old man, he reminds me... there's a girl I used to know. I took her to the movies once, my first date." Kyle looked at me for a long while. Then he leaned back and smiled. "Man," he said, "that's a bad date." Linda was 9 then, as I was, but we were in love, and it was real. When I write about her now, 3 decades later, it's tempting to dismiss it as a crush and infatuation of childhood. But I know for a fact that what we felt for each other was as deep and rich as love can ever get. It had all the shadings and complexities of mature adult love, and maybe more, because there were not yet words for it, and because it was not fixed to comparisons or chronologies or the ways by which adults measure such things. I just loved her. She had poise and great dignity. Her eyes, I remember, were deep brown like her hair, as she was slender and very quiet and fragile looking. Even then, at 9 years old, I wanted to live inside her body. I wanted to melt into her bones. That kind of love. And so, in the spring of 1956, when we were in the 4th grade, I took her out on the first real date of my life, a double date actually, with my mother and father. Though I can't remember the exact sequence, my mother had somehow arranged it with Linda's parents, and on that damp spring night, my dad did the driving while Linda and I sat in the back seat and stared out opposite windows, both of us trying to pretend it was nothing special. For me, though, it was very special. Down inside, I had important things to tell her. Big, profound things, but I couldn't make any words come out. I had trouble breathing. Now and then I'd glance over at her, thinking how beautiful she was. Her white skin, and those dark brown eyes, and the way she always smiled at the world. Always, it seemed, as if her face had been designed that way. The smile never went away. That night, I remember, she wore a new red cap, which seemed to me very stylish and sophisticated, very unusual. It was a stocking cap, basically, except the tapered part at the top seemed extra long, almost too long, like a tail growing out the back of her head. It made me think of the caps that Santa's elves wear, the same shape and color, the same fuzzy white tassel at the tip. Sitting there in the back seat, I wanted to find a way to let her know how I felt, a compliment of some sort, but all I could manage was a stupid comment about the cap. "Geez," I must have said, "what a cap!" Linda smiled at the window. She knew what I meant. But my mother turned and gave me a hard look. It surprised me. It was as if I'd brought up some horrible secret. For the rest of the ride, I kept my mouth shut. We parked in front of the Ben Franklin store and walked up Main Street toward the State Theater. My parents went first, side by side, then Linda in her new red cap, and then me tailing along 10 or 20 steps behind. I was 9 years old. I didn't yet have the gift for small talk. Now and then my mother glanced back, making little motions with her hand to speed me up. At the ticket booth, I remember, Linda stood off to one side. I moved over to the concession area, studying the candy, and both of us were very careful to avoid the awkwardness of eye contact, which was how we knew about being in love. It was pure knowing. Neither of us, I suppose, would have thought to use that word, love, but by the fact of not looking at each other and not talking, we understood with a clarity beyond language that we were sharing something huge and permanent. Behind me in the theater, I heard cartoon music. "Hey, step it up," I said. I almost had the courage to look at her. "You want popcorn or what?" The thing about a story is that you dream it as you tell it, hoping that others might then dream along with you, and in this way memory and imagination and language combine to make spirits in the head. There is the illusion of aliveness. In Vietnam, for instance, Ted Lavender had a habit of popping 4 or 5 tranquilizers every morning. It was his way of coping, just dealing with the realities, and the drugs helped to ease him through the days. I remember how peaceful his eyes were. Even in bad situations, he had a soft, dreamy expression on his face, which was what he wanted, a kind of escape. "How's the war today?" somebody would ask, and Ted Lavender would give a little smile to the sky and say, "Mellow. A nice, smooth war today." And then in April he was shot in the head outside the village of Tankay. Kiowa and I and a couple of others were ordered to prepare his body for dust-off. I remember squatting down, not wanting to look, but then looking. Lavender's left cheekbone was gone. There was a swollen blackness around his eye. Quickly, trying not to feel anything, we went through the kids' pockets. I remember wishing I had gloves. It wasn't the blood I hated, it was the deadness. We put his personal effects in a plastic bag and tied the bag to his arm. We stripped off the canteens and ammo, all the heavy stuff, and wrapped him up in his own poncho and carried him out to a dry paddy and laid him down. For a while nobody said much. Then Mitchell Sanders laughed and looked over at the green plastic poncho. "Hey, Lavender," he said. "How's the war today?" There was a short quiet. "Mellow," somebody said. "Well, that's good," Sanders murmured. "That's real good. Stay cool now. Hey, no sweat. I'm mellow." "Just ease on back then. Don't need no pills. We got this incredible chopper on call. This once-in-a-lifetime mind trip. Oh, yeah. Mellow." Mitchell Sanders smiled. "There it is, my man. This chopper gonna take you up high and cool. Gonna relax you. Gonna alter your whole perspective on this sorry shit." We could almost see Ted Lavender's dreamy blue eyes. We could almost hear him. "Roger that," somebody said. "I'm ready to fly." There was the sound of the wind, the sound of birds in the quiet afternoon, which was the world we were in. That's what a story does. The bodies are animated. You make the dead talk. They sometimes say things like, "Roger that," or they say, "Timmy, stop crying," which is what Linda said to me after she was dead. Even now I can see her walking down the aisle of the old State Theater in Worthington, Minnesota. I can see her face and profile beside me, the cheeks softly lighted by coming attractions. The movie that night was The Man Who Never Was. I remember the plot clearly, or at least the premise, because the main character was a corpse. The fact alone, I knew, deeply impressed me. It was a World War II film. The Allies devised a scheme to mislead Germany about the site of the upcoming landings in Europe. They get their hands on a body, a British soldier, I believe. They dress him up in an officer's uniform, plant fake documents in his pocket, then dump him in the sea and let the currents wash him into a Nazi beach. The Germans find the documents. The deception wins the war. Even now, I can remember the awful splash as that corpse fell into the sea. I remember glancing over at Linda, thinking it might be too much for her, but in the dim gray light she seemed to be smiling at the screen. There were little crinkles at her eyes, her lips open and gently curving at the corners. I couldn't understand it. There was nothing to smile at. Once or twice, in fact, I had to close my eyes, but it didn't help much. Even then I kept seeing the soldier's body, tumbling toward the water, splashing down hard. How inert and heavy it was, how completely dead. It was a relief when the movie finally ended. Afterward, we drove out to the Dairy Queen at the edge of town. The night had a quilted, weighted-down quality, as if somehow burdened, and all around us the Minnesota prairies reached out in long, repetitive waves of corn and soybeans. Everything flat, everything the same. I remember eating ice cream in the back seat of the Buick, and a long blank drive in the dark, and then pulling up in front of Linda's house. Things we must have said, but it's all gone now except for a few last images. I remember walking her to the front door. I remember the brass porch light with its fierce yellow glow at my own feet, the juniper bushes along the front steps, the wet grass, and Linda close behind. We were in love. 9 years old, yes, but it was real love. And now we were alone on the front steps. Finally we looked at each other. "Bye," I said. Linda nodded and said, "Bye." Over the next few weeks, Linda wore her new red cap to school every day. She never took it off, not even in the classroom, so it was inevitable that she took some teasing about it. Most of it came from a kid named Nick Vienoff. Out on the playground during recess, Nick would creep up behind her and make a grab for the cap, almost yanking it off, then scampering away. It went on like that for weeks, the girls giggling, the guys egging him on. Naturally, I wanted to do something about it, but it just wasn't possible. I had my reputation to think about. I had my pride. And there was also the problem of Nick Vienoff. so I stood off to the side, just a spectator, wishing I could do things I couldn't do. I watched Linda clamp down the cat with the palm of her hand, holding it there, smiling over in Nick's direction, as if none of it really mattered. For me, though, it did matter. It still does. I should have stepped in. 4th grade is no excuse. Besides, it doesn't get easier with time. And 12 years later, with Vietnam presented much harder choices, some practice at being brave might have helped a little. Also, too, I might have stopped what happened next. Maybe not. But at least it's possible. Most of the details I've forgotten or maybe blocked out, but I know it was an afternoon in late spring, and we were taking a spelling test. Halfway into the test, Nick Vienoff held up his hand and asked to use the pencil sharpener. Right away, a couple of kids laughed. No doubt he'd broken the pencil on purpose, but it wasn't something you could prove, and so the teacher nodded and told him to hustle it up, which was a mistake. Out of nowhere, Nick developed a terrible limp. He moved in slow motion, dragging himself up to the pencil sharpener and carefully slipping in his pencil and then grinding away forever. At the time, I suppose it was funny, but on the way back to his seat, Nick took a short detour. He squeezed between 2 desks, turned sharply right, and moved up the aisle toward Linda. I saw him grin at one of his pals. In a way, I already knew what was coming. As he passed Linda's desk, he dropped the pencil and squatted down to get it. When he came up, his left hand slipped behind her back. There was a half-second hesitation. Maybe he was trying to stop himself. Maybe then, just briefly, he felt some small approximation of guilt. But it wasn't enough. He took hold of the white tassel, stood up, and gently lifted off her cap. Somebody must have laughed, I remember, a short, tinny echo. I remember Nick Vienoff trying to smile. Somewhere behind me, a girl said, or something like that. Linda didn't move. Even now, when I think back on it, I can still see the glossy whiteness of her scalp. She wasn't bald. Not quite. Not completely. There were some tufts of hair, little patches of grayish-brown fuzz. But what I saw then, and keep seeing now, is all that whiteness. A smooth, pale, translucent white. I could see the bones and veins. I could see the exact structure of her skull. There was a large band-aid at the back of her head, a row of black stitches, a piece of gauze taped above her left ear. Nick Vienoff took a step backward. He was still smiling, but the smile was doing strange things. The whole time Linda stared straight ahead, her eyes locked on the blackboard, her hands loosely folded at her lap. She didn't say anything. After a time, though, she turned and looked at me across the room. It lasted only a moment, and I had the feeling that the whole conversation was happening between us. "Well?" she was saying. And I was saying, "Sure, okay." Later on, she cried for a while. The teacher helped her put the cap back on, and we finished the spelling test and did some finger painting, and after school that day, Nick Vienoff and I walked her home.